financial crisis recovery.
Foreclosure, short sales, bankruptcy, credit card debt, job loss, depreciating home values, money management. Peace of mind when it comes to your finances seems completely out of reach under current conditions, but there is a way to achieve it. For the next 60 minutes, you're going to find out how to cover your assets. Cover your assets.
On $50 million.
And, the thing about that, Todd, is that has more to do with the lender's problems than it has to do with the borrower sometimes. And that is why it's so critical to make sure that you find the right bank, a financially solvent bank that's highly rated. There are independent rating services that you can go look at. There's government information, government websites that you can go access the information about the banks. Make sure that you're dealing with a bank that is healthy and is highly rated. It's not going to make their problem in having to reserve for bad loans your problem, because when they have to reserve, they have to actually set aside dollars. So if they have a $1 million loan that's in default, they have to set aside $1 million, and they can't go make money on that $1 million until that issue is resolved. And it may not be your deal that's causing them to.
And in fact, usually, Tom, it's multiples of that number.
Yeah.
In many cases, if it's $1 million that's in default or in accrual, they've got 3 and sometimes 5 times that number that they can't lend to borrow their way out of the problem.
Which is a huge problem for a bank who's trying to come back, because if a bank has dropped its rating, so let's say it's gone from a 5-star to a 1-star, their way out is to work on performing loans. If they have anything that the regulators think is questionable at all, they have to reserve this money. Well, when they reserve $1 million, that affects their ability to lend, because they lend on a multiple of deposits or their capital.
Right.
So $1 million, and you probably know this, but $1 million is more like $6 to $7 million of loans for a healthy bank, where they're making a nice spread of somewhere between 2.5% and 4.5%, depending on the borrower. So they're missing out on 3%. So if you had $1 million and you had a problem, and somebody came in and said, you got to set aside this $1 million, and now you can't make $30,000-$40,000 a year on that $1 million until this is resolved, that becomes a problem when you start making it bigger numbers.
How do you buy? And we actually did a show on this very thing, and so what Tom is essentially saying is these banks have examiners, the folks who go in and audit these banks, and these small banks are under intense pressure in today's market to do what's called collateralize dollar for dollar what they have out in loans, with collateralization being real property. If a bank's not able to do that, then the regulators come in and force them to wrap up more of a borrower's collateral to substantiate that loan with a security interest. And if you're not able to do it, the bank calls the note due, and the FDIC is telling them they got to do it, and they got no choice. So that pressure is coming. So the idea of shopping for banks doesn't even occur to most people. We're going to be taking a break here right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about what an individual can do once they begin investing in building assets or an asset base. What do you see as the first step to ensuring those assets are protected properly? So we're going to talk about the beginning of how you as an individual might be able to structure yourself right from day one. So as you build your assets, you can protect your assets simultaneously. So go to break, and we'll talk about that when we return. Hey, and we are back talking with attorney Tom Fofinski, what I would consider to be the best estate planning attorney in the state with Virtus Law. Just left and talked about what an individual can do to protect their assets and to begin to build a base, even if you're early in the development of your asset portfolio. We had left the last segment talking about the fact that a lot of these small banks have a lot of pressure on them to collateralize their assets and are calling notes due. So for those of you who are out there, small business owners, have assets to protect, I want you to be thinking that if you've been doing business with a small bank and you have loans with small banks, remember the pressure that they're under, and remember that you don't want to go to someone like Tom after you've already had the bank call the note due or have begun to default on loans, because the picture changes very dramatically, and the things that you can do in the face of a legal action that is pending are very different, and Tom and I talk about the shades of gray as compared with somebody who has made these moves under an estate planning approach, and as a result is done it long in advance. So when you get to a certain point, it becomes very problematic. There's always defenses, but they become less in terms of your options. Also want to encourage you to call in or to go to our website, and our website is CYA21, and download the Financial Crisis Bible. If you have questions, if you're in a financial crisis or want to ensure that you never are, which is probably the best way to look at it, then go to CYA21.com, download the Financial Crisis Bible. Also, once again, I want to encourage you to call in. Phone number is 651-646-8255. How often do you get to call in to talk to what is possibly the best estate planning attorney in the state without having to pay to get that information? So by all means, we encourage you to do that. So back to it, Tom. What can an individual who's early in their financial lives, who's beginning to amass assets, what can they do? What are some of the basic first steps that they should be concerned with to protect those assets?
Well, exemption planning is something.
There you go.
Exemption planning is something that you can do almost any time, even if the bank has called the loan due. You can still do some exemption planning, and so that's not a bad way. Now the law has changed a little bit on this in recent years. The Minnesota legislature, as the values of houses have dropped, the Minnesota legislature has increased the amount of equity that we can store inside of our homestead. It used to be $200,000, and it jumped to $300,000, and with the annual adjustments, it's actually up to about $360,000. And so the legislature, it's kind of funny that as the values of houses have plummeted in our market, the amount of equity you can possess safely within your house has increased. So go figure. In addition to that, the Minnesota Supreme Court also had a case back in 2005 where they said that if there is a debtor and a non-debtor who share the same homestead, that it is essentially an unlimited homestead exemption as it relates to the non-debtor. So how, what does that mean? That's a lot of terminology. So let's say my wife and I go and decide to get a loan, but I'm the only one that's on the loan, and for some reason there's a problem with the loan. They won't be able to go to my house because my wife wasn't on the loan. So she enjoys the exemption entirely. So I could have $500,000 of equity in my home, and it would be all protected because my wife wasn't on there. So, when you first start to a deal, do you really need to have your wife involved? Do you really need to have your husband involved? That's a big piece of why expose assets.
That's that whole point of not commingling credit and finances if you can help it. I mean, let me back up and just make sure that we have our listeners clear. And I'm going to keep hitting this point, which is the vocabulary that a person must possess. So when Tom talks about assets that are exempt, I've always believed that you start from the worst case scenario and move out from there. It is always better to have your bases covered, which is what Tom is talking about, rather than a scramble afterwards after something's gone wrong. So that being said, what are the allowable exemptions? Well, it's interesting. When you talk about the worst case scenario, I think for most people, bankruptcy would be the worst case scenario. But I've always said, hey, look, bankruptcy is one of the best asset protection tools in existence if you know how to use it. And what Tom's talking about is these are exempt assets all the way to bankruptcy. And what Tom just described is the ability to exempt up to $360,000 in today's market. As the market's gone down in valuations of homes, ironically, we've continued to go up in what you can exempt. That doesn't mean your homes can only be worth $360,000. It means your equity position can be $360,000. You can file bankruptcy, and as an exemption, your creditors cannot touch that money. And by the way, talked about my career starting out with farmers. That exemption is now $900,000. that you can exempt in a farmstead. You don't need to be a farmer. You just need to have that property being used for agricultural purposes, whether it's a profitable venture or not, doesn't matter. You can exempt $900,000.
It's actually never been easier to be a farmer.
Yeah,
than it
yeah.
has been
So,
today.
when you think about exempt assets and what you can protect, it's astounding that a person could go through bankruptcy, protect in excess of $1 million in a qualified retirement account, $900,000 worth of equity in a farmstead, homestead, or just a single family home of $360,000. File bankruptcy, and literally you're a millionaire, and you can exempt all of those assets. So when Tom talks about beginning to, create a base as an asset protection strategy, you start off with those exempt assets. Is that right?
That's right. And that's one of those deals, too, where when you're trying to do a transaction, you're trying to get lender involvement or investor involved, and they see that you have $500,000 equity in your home, and they might see that you have, $500,000 in a 401k. They look at it and they say, okay, here's a financially stable person. If your spouse is not a co-debtor on that transaction or